Oh yeah, no, not the big, but I yeah. Do you not see my hair? That freshman way? I didn't care about my hair, but I just like, oh, I could do that.
My heart and soul. Every single week. Every single week.
It's so sad how mean you are to me. Oh my gosh. What did you say? So mean to him. Why? What did you say? Because you shot him down.
I didn't think it was funny. I didn't think it was funny.
You could have gone out with friends and all that. I did. We're not Easter. We're not the
Sorry to be so late, folks. Yes. We have an interesting situation and an interesting solution. I have not heard. I haven't heard from my TA. I can't reach him. Sorry. And I already heard out here, two people have already hoped for a certain solution to the problem, and it's the solution I've decided to adopt. Okay. You're all getting A's on your second paper. Now, I want to say this. I just want to say something about this. I can well imagine people here who think they did a really good job and probably better than most of the people in the class, and the difference between, if they're right, the difference between the good papers and the bad papers is just disappearing. And I can imagine good students feeling kind of pissed off about that. Because, sorry. But, and here's the thing about, just so you know, sort of vaguely, at least part of the reason why. I mean, you know, this is not, as they say, a residential school. You don't all live on campus, and if we could, you know, if everybody lived within 500 yards of this place, we could schedule or whatever. People are all over the county or other counties, and so, you know, getting together, A, to get the papers back to you, and then if you want to, trying to get together with a TA, it's just logistically ridiculous. So there's the solution, okay?
From the desk of Derek Garden, thank you.
Pardon me?
I said from the desk of Derek Garden, thank you. I really appreciate that.
You're quite welcome, sir. Okay, so. Okay, folks, so what we're going to talk about tonight will presumably almost certainly not take us the entire time. But I want to talk about, again, Rawls, and Rawls' idea of how to think about what civil disobedience is, and secondly, how to think about the possibility of justifying. I mean, so, but before I do that, I want to. This is something that I just fell into the habit of doing a while back. I just think it's a good idea for, especially citizens of this country, but also those of you who may not be and are just here temporarily. It's still just historically interesting information. I mean, it's very easy for Americans. Presumably this is true of each person about their own native country, at least for a lot of native countries. It's possible to grow up thinking, it's just so obvious that you live in the greatest country in the world. There's certainly a lot of Americans who think they live in the greatest country in the world, and maybe they do. But part of what goes along with that is just a kind of absence of any sense of actually what the differences are, or the similarities between this country and lots of other countries. And in particular, it occurred to me in connection with this sort of set of issues about the nature of what a just state is and the moral justifiability of breaking the law in civil disobedience against a just state. It's worth just having some quick information about where the United States was, or where it comes in history, in terms of addressing two issues that look like they're pretty fundamental to the concept of a just state. One is the recognition of slavery and its eventual abolition, and the second is the issue of universal suffrage when women get the right to vote along with the men. Right? And some of you may be fairly surprised to find out, maybe you know this, but some of you may be surprised to find out sort of where we stand on those. The first bit of information is actually, I have no idea what explains this. I don't know anything about the history of Iceland, but the country of Iceland abolished slavery in the year 1117, right? 900 years ago. As far as I know, the first country in the world to abolish slavery. But you then get this kind of history, right? In 1821, Colombia. Mexico was 1829. Argentina, 1853. The whole British Empire in 1833. And finally, in 1863, you get the Emancipation Proclamation, which only covered the Confederate States. And 2 years later, you get the 13th Amendment in 1865. So we're pretty much bringing up the rear in terms of when we got around to abolishing slavery. I skipped a whole bunch. Yeah, never mind. Actually, this is kind of odd. It's back there with Iceland. You wonder what was going on in Scandinavia. Norway is 1274. Sweden is 1335. And in between, France shows up in 1315. Croatia in 1416. Okay, anyway. So then there's the issue of women's suffrage. And there, the first country that I didn't do any serious research on this, it's pretty superficial stuff, but the first country I came across is Finland in 1906, and New Zealand in 1893, Australia 1902, so it got started down there in the Pacific, in the West Pacific. Then Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland in the 19-teens, Canada in 1917, and this is the one that sticks, might stick in your throats. After the revolution, the communist revolution, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia, the incipient evil empire in 1918 beat the United States by 2 years. Right? Women got the vote in the Russian Federation in 1918, and we adopted it in 1920. So it's just the idea just to, in case you are laboring under the impression that we're close to perfect. We haven't at least always been close to perfect. And that's not a bad thing to have in mind when you're trying to think about the issue of civil disobedience in this society. Right? There's no reason you should remember this, but I'm sure back on the first day of class, I mentioned that there had been these three periods in fairly recent American history when civil disobedience was a huge issue. Right? I mean, the biggest and most explosive was during the civil rights era, right, where the country got itself torn apart. Lots of civil disobedience going on there. Then there was civil disobedience in resistance to the Vietnam War during the late 60s and 70s, early 70s. And then more recently, some significant civil disobedience in connection with the right to life movement. So there are three different cases in, within 50 years of where people have thought, presumably, that even though the country was a reasonably just country, that there was something going on in the country that just absolutely required that they protested in the extreme form possible. Well, not the most extreme form, not with violence, but they actually break the law. So it would be nice to think that it's possible to think about the question of civil disobedience and see whether you can come up with a coherent idea of how somebody might be justified in breaking the law, peacefully breaking the law, at the same time that they admit that the country is a reasonably just country. And not the least of the reasons why that might be interesting is that I can easily imagine that there were people who found themselves on the pro-civil disobedience side on one of those three occasions recently, and on the anti-civil disobedience side on another occasion, right? You might have been thought civil disobedience is okay with respect to civil rights, not okay with respect to the war or with respect to the abortion issue, or vice versa, or whatever, right? And it would be nice to think that in your own mind, you could sort out why it's okay in one case and not in the other. What in your mind is the difference? So it's sometimes a more important topic than others, right? Namely when the situation is one that, for some people at any rate, is going to make them think seriously about engaging in it. Okay, so Rawls is not alone. In fact, he is the other eminently visible person, far more eminently visible, I should say, on the civil disobedience front in America, who shares this view, is Martin Luther King Jr. The view of how to just think about what somebody's doing when they're engaging in civil disobedience, right? I mean, they're not just breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law. I mean, how do you want to think about what they are, or at least should be, engaged in doing? And both Rawls and King think of this as basically an extreme form of communication. The idea is that it's in a desperate attempt to get people's attention drawn to some situation that needs to be straightened out. People will have tried, typically, other ways of getting the situation changed, whether it's segregation, or whether it's to shut down the war, or whether it's to shut down the abortion clinics, or whatever. Civil disobedience isn't the first thing that comes to mind. So you try other things, but at some point, what Rawls and King think is, especially probably with respect to the civil rights case, but something like this presumably is true in other cases as well, that the people who are engaging in these acts think that if the rest of the country would actually just look long enough to see what's going on, that the whole country would come around, or at least a substantial majority of the country around would come around and say this has got to be fixed, right? And so it would get fixed without further violence being done. So that's why it's thought of as a means of communication, right? You do this because you know damn well you're going to wind up on television, or you're going to wind up being paid a lot of attention, and maybe enough people will take a close enough look to see why you'd be going to such lengths, right? And then so you'll get the country will go through some kind of a conversion process, and it'll get done peacefully. So Rawls again has a set of conditions which he, and these I think I said this last time. These conditions it's perfectly clear that King would have agreed with Rawls that if these conditions are met, civil disobedience is justified. He might have thought, you should go farther than this. You don't have to have all of these conditions met in order to be justified in doing it. But so it's the same thing that we did before with Rawls's idea about the conditions under which you can become obligated in the first place to commit yourself to a given state, and to submitting yourself to the state. And so the idea is there are a lot of possible combinations of things, conditions that might give you that result, that you're now justified in, you're now morally obligated to obey the state. But we're also saying, at least if these are, and he sort of lays it on thick, right? That was the original idea, right? You're benefiting from this thing. You expect to continue to benefit from it. You expect everybody else to keep it going, partly so you can continue to benefit, right? Under all these conditions, then you're obviously justified. I mean, you're obviously obligated to obey the state. Well, the same thing here, right? The idea is that if these conditions are justified, then you're obviously justified in engaging in civil disobedience. So here's his proposal. And again, the very first one raises the an interesting problem, right? So S is justified in engaging in civil disobedience. If 4 conditions are met, and I just realized I should have said, S is justified in engaging in civil disobedience if 4 conditions are met. Civil disobedience, just to be clear about this, which I should have been from the get-go, right? It is a breaking of the law, by definition, this term means. It's a breaking of the law, but it's a non-violent breaking of the law. That's the reason for the term civil, okay? It does not involve violence, but it does involve breaking the law. So, the first condition is that there's a serious violation of the fundamental principles of justice. These are the 2 principles we talked about last time. That people in the original position of equal liberty would adopt, about keeping the maximum liberty that they can and making sure that all the offices that get created are open to everybody, right? So this is Rawls talking, right? So he's got a reference here to his own theory, but his theory is that these are the ones, if you theorize about democracy, you're going to come up with this, right? That any group of people under the conditions where you can't prejudice things in your own favor, you're going to adopt those 2 principles. They're the bedrock of real democracy in his view. So if there's been a serious violation of those principles, and secondly, you've exhausted all the ways that are available legally to try to correct the situation. And with all legal means of redress, that is, of correcting the situation, have been exhausted.
Can you read that?
Can I read it?
Yeah, something.
I can try. All legal means of redress, right? L-E-G-L. All legal means of redress have been exhausted. You've been through the courts, you've been through the Congress, you've been whatever, nothing's working. Right? Actually, should probably, as I go through here, talk about 2 things. in Thoreau's essay, I actually did read the part where he talks about this, right? You remember where he says, it's no more my business to petition the governor or the legislature than it's their business to petition me. Why the hell should I need their permission? They don't need my permission. But then he also says that the idea that you can address the situation and get the thing corrected that you think needs correcting by legal means is just unacceptable. You chew up your whole damn life, right? I'm not going to wait until the whole damn process is completed and then say, thank you, assuming that it works. If it's morally unacceptable, I'm just not doing it. I'm not going to pay the tax or whatever. So people can have more extreme views than this. Thoreau did. Here you're imagining this second case that you've done that. You've done all the legal stuff and you've been turned down. And that's actually what happened in an earlier, in the history of the United States, certainly one of the most dramatic, grotesque violations of the Constitution during the Second World War. Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order, and 108,000 Japanese American citizens on the West Coast got stuck in concentration camps. We didn't call them concentration camps, we called them something nicer than that. But that's what happened. We just rounded them up and kept them in prison until the end of the war. And they had lawyers who went to bat, tried to get this thing corrected. And in 1944, with Hugo Black writing the decision, the majority opinion, it was declared constitutional. Right? The president can just do this. He can just pick you up and toss you in jail and leave you there until some future date. So that was, and it was not until in your lifetime recently, some of you may have noticed it when it happened, it's not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, the Congress finally got around to acknowledging this thing and paying some trivial reparations to descendants of the people who had been in prison. But in any case, you can try the legal means if you want. You may not have much success. Depends on who's there and a lot of other things. Okay, so the third thing, condition that Rawls lists is that S agrees something like this, that, let's see if I can't write a little bit here. Nope, it's not that. That anyone in a similar situation is entitled to the same acts of civil obedience. So it's not just because it's me. Anybody in this kind of situation has the same right I do to break the law. Right? And the final thing is that S agrees to accept, pay, whatever's the appropriate word here, the penalty for breaking the law. If the penalty is 30 days in jail, then that's what you do, is you go to jail for 30 days. If you're paying a fine, you try to pay the fine or whatever, right? There's no challenging the acceptability of the penalty for breaking the law. You are breaking the law, and there's a penalty for that, and so you accept the penalty. Now, basically, Rawls's idea, and again, I think it's King's. I keep mentioning King because if you've never read his letter from Birmingham County Jail, you ought to read it. Look it up online. There must be 1 million copies of it there. It is sensational. It's very, very clear, systematic, clean, just goes through, beautiful way. And it matches up. I was just shocked to learn, I mean, surprised to learn, not shocked. The first time I read it, how close it is to Rawls's way of expounding the same issues. But the idea here that these guys have is that the reason that it's morally permissible for somebody to engage in civil disobedience under these conditions is that the contract between a citizen and the government in a reasonably just state has got two sides to it. Right? The reason the citizen is obligated to obey the government is that the government is a reasonably just government, and it's the contract, the Constitution is the contract between the government and its citizens, which is why for immigrants, people who become American citizens as adults, right, what you swear to do is to uphold the Constitution. You don't swear to uphold the president or the Senate or anybody else. It's the Constitution, right? And these guys' idea is, right, if there's been a violation of the fundamental principles of justice, then what that means is that the government itself has broken the contract. The Constitution limits what the government can do. And as I was saying last time, that's why that's one of the functions of the Supreme Court is to test the question whether what's coming out of the legislature and with the president's signature on it is constitutional or not. And if it's not, then it's just not law, right? It's just tossed out. It has no force whatever. It has to be within the limits of the Constitution. And so, as I say, these guys' idea is that if the fundamental principles of justice have been violated, then the Constitution has to have been violated because from Rawls's perspective, those the reason that the United States counts as a reasonably just state is that its Constitution meets the conditions. It's consistent with the consistency of the two principles of justice. So if the principles of justice have been violated by the government, that means that the Constitution has to have been as well. Okay? So the government has broken the contract, which, in the clearest, perhaps in the clearest possible case, is the Japanese case, right? I mean, it's just open and shut. These were American citizens. They had a right to their freedom, and they had a right to due process before anybody did anything to them. They had all kinds of rights. And Franklin Roosevelt just took it away, right, with the stroke of a pen. And he's just gone. In what everybody now recognizes, although people did not in 1944 recognize it, as a violation of the Constitution. Now, that example brings up, as clearly as any can, an interesting question about this first principle, this first condition that these guys lay down, right? Are the conditions under which you justified in breaking the law include that the government itself has already, in effect, broken the law. It's violated the Constitution, it's violated the fundamental principles of justice, and so the contract is broken. But the question is, right, when the question on the ground is, who decides whether there's been a serious violation of the principles of justice? There's a very famous lawyer, namely, I think his first name was Ronald Jaworski of the Jaworski etc. law firm here in town, who wound up as prosecutor ultimately in the Nixon case. And Jaworski used to be on the radio a fair amount during the late stages of the Vietnam War, just before he became the prosecutor. And it would be, because there were a lot of debates that went on during that war, public debates about civil disobedience, because people were burning their draft cards, spilling blood on selective service records, breaking the law in various non-violent ways, all sorts of violent ways, but we're focused on the non-violent ones. And so, the civil disobedience got talked about. And I pick on Jaworski. I don't pick on him just in order to pick on him. He happens to have been a very visible, powerful guy, a smart guy. And his view about civil disobedience was an absolute. Right? You're never justified in engaging in civil disobedience. And one of the things that he would say is, the way he would put it is, if his picture is, if you say civil disobedience is sometimes justified, then what you're doing is letting people pick and choose which laws they're going to obey. And if you do that, you don't have a government. You've got anarchy, right? You can't have a government in which you allow people to pick and choose what laws you're going to obey. So he was just adamant, right? Civil disobedience is just never justifiable. Well, it's worth thinking about sort of what Jaworski's thinking about here, right? When he says you can't allow people to pick and choose which laws they're going to obey, who has he got in mind? Who is it that he thinks can't allow people to pick and choose? I mean, the government's not allowing you to pick and choose. So the government says, this is a law, damn it, you can't do that, right? They're not going to say, it's okay for you to choose which laws to obey. So who is it that he's talking about? Right? When he says, one can't or you can't allow people to pick and choose because then you don't have the government. Well, there is no such person. It's a way of speaking, and I am basically quoting him, not being unfair to him. It's one of the things he standardly would say. And you can sort of understand why he would say it until you think about it. Right? There isn't anybody in a position of having any power who's saying you are allowed to pick and choose. Right? The people in power, the government, are saying, no, you're not entitled to pick and choose. You must obey all the laws. And basically, if you try to get yourself into the mind of this person you don't know, who's making this argument, what he's saying is that, at least I think this is a fair way to represent what he's saying, that as far as he's concerned, it's always wrong for anybody to break the law. He would find it unacceptable for somebody to think that although they admit that on the whole they're obligated to obey the law because it's a reasonably just country, on this issue they're not, and they're going to break the law in an attempt to get it changed. I think Jaworski's idea is that he would never approve that, and nobody should ever approve it, because if you do, you're starting to sow the seeds of anarchy, right? Everybody gets to pick and choose what laws you're going to obey. Well, there are two things about that. The first thing to notice about it is that assuming you grant that a government, no matter how good its constitution, is run by human beings, none of whom are perfect, you have to recognize the possibility that that government is going to do something that is clearly in violation of its own constitution. The president and or the Supreme Court or the legislature or the combination of them all, they're just going to do something that violates the Constitution, as they did, in fact, in 1941, 1944. So it looks as though what Jaworski's committed to, I mean, I was never, unfortunately, with him. I never had a chance to just ask him this question. I wish nobody else asked him. But there's the question to ask. Well, Mr. Jaworski, suppose that this were to happen. And you could even remind him of the Japanese. I mean, he knew about that. Would you say that even then, it's not permissible to break the law? You just have to accept that the government is going to do this. It's going to violate its own constitution, and that's the end of the story. So I don't know what he would have said to that. I mean, I'd like to think that all you had to do was hit him over the head with this 2x4. You can't just say whatever the government does, the right thing to do is to obey it. Surely, that's not something he would want to say. But set that aside. I mean, the second thing about this is that, about this basic view, is that it's directly contradictory to the view of the folks who put the country together. The folks that wrote the Constitution for this country were nowhere near optimistic that it was going to be a permanent set of institutions. Benjamin Franklin, in fact, estimated, as a result of his wide knowledge of the history of Europe and his own personal history, that probably every 25 years, if you want to have serious constitutional government, you're probably going to have a revolution about every 25 years. Why is that? Because the government is run by fallible human beings, and it's just not going to work. People are vulnerable to bribes. They're vulnerable to having their power bought. You can't expect human institutions not to degrade over time. And so you can start out and hope for the best, but you cannot let yourself be deceived into thinking that now everything's fine, now that we've created this wonderful government. So their idea was everybody had to keep an eagle eye on the government and see whether or not make sure they were in fact operating within the legal limits of their own power. And if they weren't, you needed to do something about it. So, the transition from the guys that put the thing together and how clear they were about the need, about it being our government and it's responsive to us, and we have to make sure it's sticking within its own limit, to the kind of thing that you could hear, and I'm sorry to pick on Jaworski again, but that kind of view that it is something wholly about the operations of the United States government. It's always wrong to disobey it. No, it's not actually. But what it comes down to is the question I was asking: who decides whether there's been a serious violation of the principles that would justify somebody in engaging in civil disobedience? And the answer, which the founders knew and which many people seem not to understand, is that it's you and it's me. Who the hell else would it be? It's our government. Right? We're the people who put the thing in power. We're the one who have this deal with the government that's going to live within its own executive authority. And we are the ones, in the end, who have to decide whether or not this government has run off the rails when it interns Japanese, when it maintains segregation or whatever. And something has got to be done because the system is not working, and it's got to be changed so that it's back working within its own legitimate boundaries. There's the end of my sermon about civil disobedience. And the last thing I will say to you officially, yes.
No, I know. I was just waiting.
Oh, you were just moving your hair, okay. Anybody? Okay, the exam is on some Thursday night, I believe. It's either that or it's a Tuesday night. It's the 14th, is that right? It's a week from this coming Tuesday, in that case. And it goes from 5 until 6:30, right? Yeah, it's just like the midterm. It's a half-term exam. Yes.
Is there a specific amount of the questions on paper that you gave that will be on the test? Like
You're going to need to answer 3 questions.
3 questions?
3 questions. And you'll always have some choice about which one to answer.
How big of a answer thing?
A small blue book. You need a blue book. Yeah. A small one will be fine. If it's not, I'll have some extra paper with me. And you can, yeah.
Will there also be any multiple choice? Like
No. The exam is strictly essay, and you'll just have to write 3 essays. Yeah. Today, this is our last class, right? You've listened to me for the last time. Very sweet. Yes. Hang on just a second, folks, just so we get these questions. Yeah. Half your grade. Oh, some of you came in late. You don't know this, but you got an A on your paper. Everybody's getting A's because the system got fouled on. Nice work. See you in a week and a half, folks.
We already have